anybody who would listen to me is that, you know, you got to start peeping the game. The game is the game of life. You got to start peeping how they're doing it. And if you see it, you can see the little signs that says that the guns are turning away from, you know, Europe and Russia and Iran and Iraq, and they're turning to us. You can look at it where they're building more jails. They're starting to sell jail space. Yeah. You know, jail is big business. Believe me, I'm in jail. I see the big business.
What began as a script titled, "Why Does Muslim Activism Start and End at Malcolm X?" has now evolved into a script that talks about how the United States government has repressed Muslim political life across political bounds, ideological bounds, communal bounds, and how it's been going on for decades. Now, in this video, I want to show how state repression was and is used against Muslim political life and social organizing, and how the legacy of Malcolm X and Muslim activism has widened the sense of solidarity within the United States. We will start our narrative in the 1960s, where the United States has waged a continuous domestic counterinsurgency campaign against Muslim organizers. Black, Arab, Sunni, Shiite, revolutionary, reformist, even simple charities all fell into the sights of the United States government. We'll be looking at how the guises of counter-extremism and counter-crime and terrorism, starting out from COINTELPRO all the way into the evolution of things like Project Esther. We'll also acknowledge and see how this campaign was driven by Islamophobia, anti-blackness, anti-Arab, and especially anti-Palestinian racism. And this has taken many forms, from assassinations, political imprisonment, deportation, surveillance, smear campaigns, and the consistent prosecution of innocent people disguised as counterterrorism or anti-crime enforcement, with Islam and Muslim society being seen as a motivating factor or a foreign element that has to be consistently watched. However, it's important within our own research to not talk about our repression only, but also the attempts of Muslim liberation and organizing within the American context. From Islam in the prisons, Islam in the Black Liberation Movement, and the widening of the Palestinian struggle within the United States, we can see how Islam and Muslims have forced and fought for their own agency within the American context. This is something that our communities should acknowledge and glorify a lot more. Now, I think Malcolm X is the best candidate to begin our entire video on. For modern Muslim English-speaking communities, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz remains an icon close to our hearts. His accurate analysis of American racism, his spiritual transformation from the Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam, and the sheer number of converts just due to his autobiography alone has etched him into the psyche of American society, black or white. Likewise, Shabazz is often the first touchstone of Islam within American communities, especially the black community, as a symbol of dignity, resistance, and faith. Likewise, Malcolm X faced a lot of government repression in his time. So we have to ask ourselves now, why is Malcolm X the only political activist organizing Muslim figurehead so invoked in our Muslim communities, and does it stop at him? Did his type of revolutionary Islamic and Muslim political organizing in the US stop and start with him? Did it become stagnant after his martyrdom in 65? Shocker here, but the answer is no.
Mr. X, I said in introducing you earlier that your group has been charged with being anti-white, anti-Semitic, and a kind of black Ku Klux Klan. Now, you've heard that charge before.
Yes, sir.
And what is your answer to it?
It's nothing could be farther from the truth. First, when you introduced me as the leader of the black supremacist movement here in Harlem or here in New York, that in itself, too, is incorrect.
But even with forming our own start, we have to understand Malcolm X. Now, most Muslim Americans would argue that we understand Malcolm X. I'd argue we don't understand Malcolm X. What we have is like a very almost secularized or whitewashed apolitical version of Malcolm X, in my opinion. And yes, that does include his anti-racist stance. Now, Malcolm X in Muslim circles, his narrative tends to be, he went to jail as a criminal and crook, Within jail, he learned about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, where he then joined and rose throughout the ranks of the Nation of Islam, where he then became a reverse racist and a black supremacist and a black separatist, before being sidelined by Elijah Muhammad and his family, where he then went on to Hajj and converted to Sunni Islam, where he then returned to Islam, proclaiming that Islam is the solution, as some political parties would proclaim, where he was then assassinated by the Nation of Islam with collaboration from the United States government. And to add tragedy to it, this was at a moment when Malcolm X was creating Muslim Mosque Incorporated and was taking a lot of people from the Nation of Islam into Sunni Islam. Now, give or take certain elements, this narrative tends to be dominant also within the secular and non-Muslim circles, maybe more or less emphasis on Islam, depending on who you ask, more emphasis on his black power, more emphasis on his leftist leaning, so on, so forth. I've seen some crazy arguments for Malcolm X. It's also not fully wrong. Okay, maybe the reverse racism, black supremacist one, but in most cases, they're not. Back to the point. But for Muslim communities here, the narrative on Muslim organizing starts and ends here. Now, before we even start with the wider repression of Muslim political and activist life, let's look at Malcolm X and the different ideas that he inspired or added onto. Let's first try to break him down as a figure and then his multiple ideas. First of all, Malcolm X is probably the first public Sunni Muslim victim of a counterinsurgency campaign through COINTELPRO. If we're going to exclude Toby from Roots, which is more of a British counterinsurgency campaign that the Brits are very good at doing. They've been doing it for centuries at this point. Likewise, Malcolm X is a person that was going through a lot of evolutions in his life. He liked Nasser. He liked King Faisal. These guys did not like each other at all. So we have to take that into account. But Malcolm X is evoked by these socialists for his harsh criticisms of capitalism, accurately pointing out that capitalism relies on racism to have a population to subjugate and exploit their labor and profit from. Likewise, Malcolm X also points out that many of the anti-colonial movements against the colonial powers adopted socialist viewpoints. Yeah.
As was stated earlier, all of the countries that are emerging today from under the shackles of colonialism are turning towards socialism. I don't think it's an accident. Most of the countries who were colonial powers were capitalist countries. And the last, a bulwark of capitalism today is America. And it's impossible for a white person to believe in capitalism and not believe in racism. When you find one, yes, you can't have capitalism without racism. And if you find one, and you happen to get that person into a conversation, and they have a philosophy that makes you sure that they don't have this racism in their outlook, usually they're socialists, or their political philosophy is socialism.
Beyond importance, Pan-Africanists, and I'm talking about Pan-Africanists like Kwame Ture, not Dr. Umar. Dr. Umar invoked Malcolm X as a person who called for land rights, for political and economic liberation of Africa, because the improvement of Africa would lead to the improvement of the black diaspora, where the black diaspora would gain economic and political power, and Pan-Africanism likes that a lot.
Black man in America, in a strong Africa, and the necessity of the Afro-American becoming inseparably linked with the overall program that's existing on the African continent. The two problems must be solved together, and the two forces must go forward together. And so the Organization of Afro-American Unity has a program to link the Afro-Americans with the Africans and the Africans with the Afro-Americans. When I say Afro-Americans, I mean those throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. This is our only hope. Our hope is in a strong Africa. And when Africa is strong, our position in America will be one of respect. But if Africa is weak, we will never be in a position of respect in America.
Likewise, Malcolm X describes himself as a black nationalist Pan-Africanist. This viewpoint only strengthened when Malcolm X traveled to Africa and visited the Sunni African world. Lastly, for Islamic movements, they invoked Malcolm X, pointing out that his idea of Islam as a global system to oppose Western domination and racism and giving a moral backbone to societies, is pretty in line with a good amount of Islamic movements or Islamist movements, if those are the terms you want to use. Malcolm X says that Islam was a huge force to oppose Western European Christian domination, and that it was also a place of breaking the mental shackles of Western domination of especially black communities. I mean, Al-Qaeda affiliated Al-Shabaab quotes Malcolm X in their propaganda campaign for English-speaking recruiters, and I mean, the Taliban even called Obama a house Negro. I had the footage, I lost it, you just have to trust me on that one. Likewise, in Turkey, white passing Turks paint up pictures of Malcolm X and Mohammed Morsi as examples of pan-Islamic unity. But also, we have to take into account the Malcolm X narrative we have at the moment is a very defanged, almost apolitical example of Malcolm X. Malcolm X, we have to take into account, was only Sunni Muslim for about 6 months. He advocated for black nationalism. He described himself as a Pan-Africanist. He praised Gamal Abdel Nasser. He also praised King Faisal. However, this doesn't mean Malcolm X is only tied to one position. Malcolm X's politics, which I'd argue leans heavily onto Islam. He speaks and gives major support to Muslim struggles like Palestine and Gaza. He always talks about how Islam is breaking the racism within the Umrah trip. Oh, I dropped my pop filter. Malcolm X went on to argue that black Americans, and even white Americans to a certain extent, should adopt Islamic customs as it's the strongest thing to break the mental colonial shackles of white European, as he would describe, racist Christian traditions.
That division, or out of those who left, was formed an authentic religious group known as Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which practiced the religion of Islam as it is practiced and taught in Cairo and Lahore and other parts of the Muslim world. But those who went into the orthodox practice of the Islam religion in the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, at the same time we realized that we were black people in a white society, that we were black people in a racist society. We were black people in a society whose very political system was based and nourished upon racism, whose social system was a racist system, whose economic system was nourished with racism. We were black people who wanted to be religious, who wanted to practice brotherhood and all of that, who wanted to love everybody and all of that too. But at the same time, that was a dream. We had to also face reality and realize that we were in a racist society that was controlled by racists from the federal government right on down to the local government, from the White House right on down to City Hall. Racism was what we were confronted by. So we knew that this was a problem that was beyond religion, and we formed another organization that was non-religious. And this organization was called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or the OAAU. And we got the idea for it from travels and observation of the success that our brothers on the African continent were having in their struggle for freedom. We're getting free faster than we.
And this is why I included Malcolm X in this video, because Malcolm X, like I said earlier, is the start point of Muslim political organizing and social life. Taking that into account, we could see how the following Islamic, Muslim, or just full of Arab movements come into conflict with the racist power structures of America, especially in the 60s and 70s from COINTELPRO. We also see how the ghost of COINTELPRO affects Muslim social and political activism and organizing until today. Now, let me state, Malcolm X never created a Islamic or Islamist movement in his political life. The closest we get to is the Nation of Islam, which kind of toes the line of what we would consider orthodoxy Islam. Yet I'd also argue the Nation kind of uses and echoes the rhetoric of Islamist movements and political understanding within the Muslim world at times. That's a discussion for another comment section, okay? However, Malcolm X did have the idea of social organizing reliant upon Islam, especially for the black community. which would foster a sense of brotherhood and moral clarity and moral foundation and social change that is against Western European norms. It's also the start of this new section in a segue, because the idea of social organizing heavily based upon Islam and Islamic norms as a moral and even political framework to achieving some level of economic, social, or political self-liberation. Likewise, it places political Islam in the context of America in the 60s and 70s, which was heavily influenced by the Black Power movement and other ethnic and racial power movements. This is where I'd make the argument movements such as the Black Sunni movement, the Dar-ul-Islam movement, is a form of Muslim activism and organizing after Malcolm X's death. Now, I should also state the Dar movement was not the only Black Sunni or Black Shia or Black whatever acceptable form of Muslim and Islam movement formed in the US, but it will be the main focus of this video, especially later on. Likewise, the Dar movement was the biggest and most successful one. Now, Dar is clearly not a successor to Malcolm X and was first of all an Islamic social organizing movement, not a leftist revolutionary movement. However, it falls within Malcolm X's viewpoint of Islam as a social organizer, and it caught itself going against the oppressive status quo against Black people in the 60s. Like I said, this movement isn't like inherently a Black nationalistic, socialist, or pan-African group. The group actually denounced forms of nationalism and argued for pan-Islamic unity. It's very clearly an Islamically driven movement that has its own viewpoints of nationalism and liberation, yet heavily supported and physically helped Black and Latino communities in their nationalistic values and sentiments when organizing within them. I'd also want to point out that the Dar movement begins in the late stages of Malcolm X's life, and Malcolm X chose to not join the Dar but to create OAAU and Muslim Mosque Incorporated. This is where the Dar is able to take its own life with its ability to incorporate Sunni orthodoxy and even Islamist concepts from thinkers like the Arab Egyptian such as Hassan al-Banna and Pakistani Abdul Allah Maududi, while still addressing the issues of the Black and brown communities facing American injustice. This ranges from things such as economic independence, where community members would come together to create and open the first few halal restaurants within America, organizing Muslim bazaars for Muslims to buy off each other, giving themselves a local economy, and also creating a nationwide newspaper called Jihadul Akbar that advocated for topics such as Islamic solidarity, beyond nationalism. It covered police harassment of Muslims, it covered prison abolitionist ideas, and massive support for Palestinian self-determination and the elimination of Zionist lobbies within the US. And they were very clear about being anti-Zionist, which, like in the 70s, basing themselves off a lot of Islamist frameworks. Just give credit where credit's due. I've read some of this stuff in the 70s. It's intense. And if we are to take from the book Dar-ul-Islam, Principle, Praxis, and Movement by Kamal Hassan, one of the founding members of the Dar, he shows the overlap of Islamic and Pan-African thought when we look at this quote. The Jawala Scouts were the stateside Muslim foray into a sort of leadership and development engaged by the young pioneers in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, or the Muslim youth groups common to the Ikhwan al-Muslimin and Imam Hassan al-Banna's Egypt. Outside of political education and community outreach, the Dar-ul-Islam movement also engaged in community defense, which had their own security structure called Rad, thunder, pulling from the Quran chapter Surah Al-Rad. We can't forget that the Dar movement was formed in the 60s and 70s at a moment of social upheaval. You had the war in Vietnam, you had the power movements. Simply put, you had crime, and I know there's a nuanced discussion on crime and how to deal with it, but people also just don't like crime happening down their block, and sometimes the community comes together to deal with it. And the Dar was able to incorporate Vietnam War vets, honorably discharged, dishonorably discharged. They're able to incorporate ex-criminals, unemployed people, what Fanon would call the lumpen proletariat, along with college students, into their security structure. The group provided security to the Dar's main mosque and combated local crime in New York. While violent confrontations were rare, Rod met them resolutely, determined to prevail. Rod was well trained. One notable training regiment was the weekly run around Brooklyn's Ridgewood Reservoir by groups of 30 to 40 young brothers, mostly African Americans, in green uniforms and Arab keffiyehs, or headscarves carrying wooden replicas of M16 rifles, a sight not entirely welcome by locals or New York's finest, who monitored the group quite closely. Rod, however, was proficient in firearms and military tactics, and readily fulfilled their crucial role as an effective Islamic militia on one hand and keepers of the peace on the other. M16 rifles, camo in public spaces, Arab keffiyehs. Talk about black people leading American culture once again. Likewise, organizing and protecting the community wasn't tied to just outside the walls. The Dar movement was also involved in prison organizing, outreach, and prisoner rights. Now, the late 60s, 70s, and 80s in the US was a time of black revolutionary struggle along with other movements. The many racial and ethnic power movements were in full swing, especially the Black Power movement. This is where you see things such as the Black Panther Party, the very famous example, and you also have the less famous example of the Black Underground, such as the Black Liberation Army. Now, I should state, quoting Wikipedia, from 1970 to 1981, the Black Liberation Army was a black nationalist, Marxist-Leninist armed group that conducted war against America. There's no other way to word it. The BLA was founded a part of what people would call the wider Black Underground, which aimed and committed attacks against the United States in the name of black national liberation. And these groups were diverse. I'll never forget being at an event and hearing a speaker say that the BLA, they half jokingly said it, the BLA was split between Yorubans and Muslims. Because we have to take into account, for many Muslims within the BLA, Islam was their moral foundation, breaking away from the Western Christian European domination, and Malcolm X was the personality that gave them a sense of moral clarity in their cause. For these Muslims, Islam is a religion that believes in fighting against evil by any and all means necessary, and they just viewed their struggle in the BLA or the Black Underground as a part of that. If anything, Islam was reinforcing their humanity and their spirituality. Now, this guerrilla war against the U.S. took multiple avenues of organizing and violence. First of all, the war was very apparent on the outside, shootings, bombings, whatever. However, the prison systems were also being used to arrest and to confine black revolutionary activists under the guise of combating crime and sometimes just outright political. And just like when you lock up a bunch of political radicals in jails, the jails became sites of black rebellion, black radicalism, and prison uprisings. Attempts were then made by the government to repress the suspected black radical elements, which they called the militant minority, against the wider apolitical prisoners called the passive majority. For the U.S. prison system, the multiple prison uprisings, especially the Attica prison rebellion, which involved a lot of Muslim elements, was the government's biggest fear. And in this war, it would pit the prison organizers against the prisons. As both sides attempted to win over the prison population, attempts to attack the militant minority would always disproportionately fall upon the Muslim prisoner population. As Islam and Muslims, even until today, is still tied to the Black Power movement within the jails. And I mean, yeah, a lot of these black radicals were Muslims. Don't take my word for it. Just see how the U.S. government allowed experiments on black Muslim organizers and a attempt to find ways to rewire the mind to go against radical ideologies. And at the symposium was Barrett S. Brown, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. In 1961, Brown had attended The Power to Change Behavior, and after hearing a presentation on coercive persuasion, he issued what amounted to a national mandate for prison administrators to experiment on recalcitrant black Muslims. Within this context, we can see how the prisons are kind of outright anti-Islamic, Islamophobic, discriminatory to the Muslims, viewing Islam and the Muslim prison population as one of the most radical elements to combat. Now, this battle between the Muslim militant minority, or Muslim dominated, and the prisons could really be seen at Green Haven Prison, where targeted and captured BLA figures and suspected BLA supporters included Muslims such as Daruba bin Wahad, Jalil Muttaqin, and Albert Noah Washington, who were placed under constant surveillance. Likewise, Muslim prisoners who organized things such as public prayer events, trying to organize iftar or suhoor for Ramadan, getting Qur'ans, prayer rugs, halal meat, all of these things would place the Muslim prison population into conflict with the prison system. All of these Muslims were placed under the suspicion of counter-extremism and political radicalism. Talk about a reoccurring theme. Honestly, what is written in Tip of the Spear, which is an amazing book I think any Muslim and black organizer or activist should read, summarizes this point clearly. Moreover, much of what I cover has direct and indirect links to ongoing methods employed in the global war on terror, where techniques that were tested on black and overwhelmingly Muslim revolutionaries at home were redeployed abroad and vice versa. Guantanamo Bay is the sum total of what they've been doing to Muslims in U.S. prisons for decades, explained Black Panther Party BLA veteran Daruba bin Wahad. No surprise here, but the war in the prisons also spread to communities outside. This is something the Dar movement publicly comments on within their newspaper, Jihad al-Akbar, where they have an open letter from Muslim prisoners which highlight the oppression that Muslims were facing in the jails. Here's a introduction just from that open letter. We wish to call to attention to the fact that in this capitalist country, prisons in actuality are multi-million-dollar businesses operating in the guise of rehabilitation and criminal detention. These brutal and inhumane tactics are primarily directed towards Muslim brothers and sisters, as well as other men and women behind bars who refuse to become a product of this fallacy. And other than just prisoner-like lettering, the Dar also was active in prison organizing as they aimed to improve the conditions and the religious freedom of Muslim prisoners, which also segued into other religious minority groups. Within the context of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we can see how the Dar movement enters the prison systems and how they improve the situation for the Muslim population while also combating racism. The Dar, within their time at Greenhaven, advocated for the creation of a physical masjid within the prison for the Muslim prison population, something Muslim prisoners were already advocating for on their own behalf. The Dar being an outside force to apply pressure, prisoners being an inside force to apply pressure, then negotiated with the prison to see the establishment of Masjid Sankor, named after the famous Masjid Sankor in Mali. This was followed by Dawah programs and Islamic education programs being launched inside of the prison system. A small victory in a sea of American oppression within the prisons. And the Dar was pretty big. For example, H. Rap Brown converted to Islam after interacting with Dar-ul-Islam members in his jail sentencing time. Likewise, the success in Greenhaven spread, and it became the bare minimum for Dar in their future endeavors in advocating for Muslim prisoner rights nationwide. Likewise, Muslim prisoners saw that victory as a tangible goal to achieve. And this is very important within prison organizing, where we see the outside community put pressure on the prisons and the inside prisoners to put pressure on the prison to force a negotiation. In this case, it was better living conditions with more religious freedom. Now, in the end, in the wider picture, COINTELPRO, government repression, internal group differences kind of led to the slow destruction or changing or ending of the power movements of the 70s and 80s. It was also within this time in 1965 where the Alien Act was finally crushed. This now allowed people such as Arabs, Africans, Southeast Asians to enter the U.S., and this would change the environment and the population of the Muslim community here.
I believe that would be the final solution to the Palestinian problem.
I'm not talking about final solutions. I'm talking about a problem that has to be solved. If they're in this country, they will vote the Jews out of a state. If they're outside of the country, they will hate us from the outside. And I'd rather have a distant hating neighbor than a close one.
Israel is also assured that no matter what it does, this is very important, Who will pay for it? The United States.
The U.S., and it links them together.
But now let's take a step back from black radical tradition stuff, because Islam in America, Islam in general, isn't solely tied to the black radical tradition or the black liberation struggle. Likewise, the situation of Muslims and Islam has evolved since the 60s and 70s. Just trust me for a minute, let's segue to something a lot less controversial. Jihadism, Jews, Arabs, Palestine, Islamic terrorism in the U.S. context. Look, guys, my channel's already filled with jihadism stuff, so I might as well just continue in my own tradition. Now, in the aftermath of the racial and ethnic power movements of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and COINTELPRO against global communism and the Black Power movement specifically, what we can see is an evolution of COINTELPRO. This time, the hammer began to shift against Muslim and Arab activism and organizing, starting off with the fear of communism and then shifting towards international global jihadism terrorism, especially tied to Palestinian identity. This originally began under counter-communism and then just changed into counter-terrorism. In 1987, 7 Palestinians and 1 Kenyan immigrant, all of them immigrants, were arrested by the government and faced deportation for their involvement in Palestinian activism. This would be called the LA 8. And I should point out, the LA 8 were a pretty diverse group of people. Not all of them were Muslim. You had Palestinian Christians in it. Likewise, you had a Kenyan immigrant. All of them immigrants, though, were still under the threat of deportation for supporting global communism. The justification being that these activists were handing out the AALDEF newspaper from the communist Marxist-Leninist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a designated terrorist group by the United States. I should state, very importantly, none of the LA 8 gave material support to the PFLP, nor did they organize any donations for any armed groups that would be seen as a foreign terrorist organization. This is even acknowledged by the FBI. From the outset, the government had admitted that none of the right had engaged in any criminal, much less terrorist activities. FBI Director William Webster admitted that a 3-year FBI investigation had found no evidence of criminal or terrorist activities, that they were arrested because they are alleged members of a worldwide communist organization. And what this shows is the evolution of COINTELPRO, moving from counter-communism and black radicalism or leftist radicalism and being used against Muslim organizing. And this is how we could see the political nature of these arrests. The FBI even acknowledged these groups weren't a part of a terrorist organization, and if anything, the LA 8 was an opening volley that was used to target Palestinian activism in Southern California. Now, the case would be dragged on for 20 years, ending in 2007. Ultimately, all of the charges were thrown out, and the judge who finally gave this verdict described it as an embarrassing moment for American law. However, the effects of this case cannot be ignored, and it lasted 20 years, so it terrorized the immigrant community, who very clearly understood that non-citizens, immigrants, will face political violence by the U.S. under the threat of deportation, especially if you are a brown or a Muslim or Arab organizer, especially if you're criticizing American foreign policy. No surprise here, but the LA 8 case isn't the only case of the rising American government repression against Muslim and Arab activist organizing in the post-Cold War era, as now the U.S. employed secret evidence, which in short meant that the U.S. could arrest any immigrant and even citizen on the fear that there's evidence that can't be shared because it's a national security threat, and if it is to be released, the terrorists will win. And this was used multiple times by the government against Palestinians and Egyptians. For example, Palestinian immigrant Hani Karaldin was associated with an unknown terrorist group, being in prison for 19 months before multiple judges threw the case out because secret evidence was the only thing presented. Likewise, Egyptian Nasser Ahmed was arrested and he was accused of being associated with a known terrorist group. When the US government faced the lawsuit, they finally identified the group as Al-Gamal Islamiyya and tied him to Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman, aka the Blind Sheikh. Once information was finally presented to Ahmed, he was able to prove his innocence as he only met the Sheikh at a talk at a masjid and asked the Sheikh for marriage counseling. That's it. The case was thrown out. The use of secret evidence was clearly an attempt by the government to shield themselves as they committed half-hearted or just completely incompetent operations in their investigations. This could once again be summarized by David Cole. Since 1987, I have represented 13 non-citizens against whom the government has sought to use secret evidence. In each case, the government initially claimed that evidence showed non-citizens to be threats to national security. In each case in which the charges were disclosed, they consisted of little more than guilt by association. In no case was the non-citizen ultimately determined to pose any threat to national security. Likewise, political violence in this case wasn't just tied to the state, but the non-state. And this is where we could look at the role of violence against Palestinian and Arab activists and organizers in the US by the Jewish Defense League, the JDL for short. Now, the JDL was, kind of still is, a terrorist organization and network that operates in America, Canada, and Israel that propagates the ideology of Kahanism. Now, in short, Kahanism, created by Rabbi Meir Kahane, believes that Israel is a religious, legitimate, promised by God, Jewish state that should always have a Jewish majority, and that all non-Jews, especially Muslim Arabs, should be eliminated, pushed out, or turned into slaves for the Jewish population in Israel and Samaria, Judea and Samaria as they call it. Now, the JDL and wider Kahanist movement has links and committed multiple terrorist attacks against Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians in the United States and Palestine itself. The group also targets neo-Nazis, but we're not going to equate the two, okay? I should state, as of the writing of this, the JDL is now a designated terrorist group in the United States in 2001, yet the group was active in bombing campaigns against Palestinian activists since 1972. So let me just list out some of their operations in the city of Los Angeles alone. In 1972, the JDL bombs the apartment of Mohammed Saatef in LA after physically attacking him for speaking on TV. In 1972, the JDL bombs the Lebanese consulate in LA. In 1974, the JDL bombs the United Nations Associated Office in LA. In 1978, the JDL bombs the screening of a Palestinian documentary in LA. In 1985, the JDL bombs and assassinates Alex Ode, who was the West Coast director of the ADC, which is a clear-cut political assassination of an Arab organizer. Likewise, the JDL was also establishing training camps in the U.S. using IDF veterans and military tactics to train their people. Likewise, internationally, the JDL worked on sending Jews to fight and serve in the IDF to kill Arabs. Like, bro, picture if a masjid was organizing people to join jihadist groups in the Middle East with the goals of killing kafirs. That would never fly. Now, the most infamous example of Kahanism violence and JDL connections to Kahanist violence, if not directly, actually pretty directly, is when JDL member Bruch Campbell Goldstein immigrated, traveled to, however you want to describe it, but he went to live in Israel in 1983. He then served in the IDF as a hardcore Kahanist, where he even refused to give aid to non-Jewish allies like Arabs, Druze. If you weren't a Jew, he didn't want to touch you. Bars. Once leaving the IDF, Goldstein continued on his radicalism, and in February 25th, 1994, Goldstein dressed up in his ex-IDF uniform and went to the Ibrahim Masjid during Friday prayers in the occupied West Bank. And he waited until the Muslims were in sujood prayer position where he then tossed a grenade into the congregation and fired into a crowd of Palestinian worshippers with his Galil assault rifle. Goldstein killed 29 Palestinians and wounded over 125 before being killed by the crowd that hit him upside the head with a fire extinguisher and beat him to death. In the following days, Palestinians would riot against this massacre. Today, Kahanism is mainstream in Israel, where the Kahanist party, Otsamin Yahud Party, leader used to hang a picture of Goldstein in his living room. That leader is Itamar Ben-Gvir, the current Minister of National Security for Israel and leading the genocide in Gaza. In short, the JDL and non-state Zionist violence has spread across the U.S. and has incited Israeli fascist violence in LA. Likewise, activists like the LA 8 had to deal with this aggressive violence and state violence of deportation and arresting. This was at a time where Arab activists, Muslim activists were facing physical violence and were facing deportation, suspicion, and surveillance. And this, in my opinion, is a moment of an infusion between state and non-state oppression of Muslim and Arab organizers, whether or not there was collaboration on purpose. And I'm not arguing that there was clear-cut collaboration between the JDL and like the FBI or something, but I think it's fair to argue that these two yin and yangs, possible not yin and yang, violence against Arabs and Muslim activism was there. You know, for all intents and purposes, it seems like the U.S. was more hard-pressed arresting black, Muslim, and Arab organizers than the actual Jewish terrorists who were bombing people and killing people. And also, we have to take into account the U.S. only designated the JDL as a terrorist group after 9/11 and after the JDL was forming an assassination plot against a government official and tried to blow up the King Fahd Masjid in LA. I mean, this dynamic of Jewish extremist violence or Jewish supremacist violence is very clear, especially at the UCLA encampment, where Zionists were waving JDL flags and attacked Muslim students. Likewise, the leader, the president of the ADL, is seen with these JDL flags. With all of that being said, I still think it's beyond important to acknowledge that there was and is Muslim extremism within the world, and that the United States, especially in the 1990s, was a target of radical Islamist jihadists, however we want to describe them. And we especially saw these moves and creation of cells by Arab Islamists who moved from the Muslim world into the U.S. Some veterans from the Afghan jihad, others who were just a part of wider jihadist or Islamist movements. You also had multiple plots and attacks committed by these guys. You know, I want to put this all in the historical context because as Muslims, we should really know our history and the agency of people within our communities and how we could address these topics. I mean, for example, the founder of the JDL, Meher Kaham, was assassinated by an Egyptian immigrant, El Sayed Nusor, in Manhattan. Nusor later on found out to have ties to Maktab al-Qadamat, Osama bin Laden, and later on Al-Qaeda. To be honest, Nusor's whole trial is kind of crazy, and technically speaking, he didn't kill Kahanim. I personally believe he did, which is why I titled it this way. You can look at the Wikipedia article whenever you guys want to. However, as we saw with many of these cases and how much free reign the JDL had to just commit violence and spread their ideology, it seems like the U.S. government took aim at these Muslim and Palestinian and Arab organizers and demonized Palestinian activism while giving a blind spot to Jewish extremism and terrorism. This included racist policies, secret and classified information, the threat of deportation, practically silencing a whole community of people. Now, I should state that the United States' concern for jihadist movements globally wasn't formed in some empty vacuum. After the Gulf War, many jihadist movements, especially that of Al-Qaeda's and Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, those type of figures, began to shift from fighting the Soviets towards fighting the Americans and many US-backed Muslim dictatorships. And within this wider campaign against America, this is where you see things such as plots like the 1993 World Trade Center bombing by Rami Youssef, who was funded by Osama bin Laden. You would see the CIA headquarters shooting by a Pakistani national who was angered by American foreign policy towards Palestinians. And this is where you would see things like the New York City landmark bombing plot, which were all of these things in motion. You had the Bojangles plot, you had so many things at play. I think it's also important to acknowledge that Muslim extremism was and is a real world issue and was one in the United States in the 1990s, especially when the Arab Islamists and the Afghan Arabs, as they were called, moved from the Muslim world into the United States and Europe. Some of the veterans of the Afghan Jihad and other jihads had tied themselves to these plots and attacks being committed. So it is important to put all of this within the historical context. I mean, the founder of the JDL, Meher Kahim, was assassinated by Egyptian immigrant El Said Nusayr in Manhattan. Nusayr later on found out to have ties to Maktab al-Qadamat, Osama bin Laden, and later on Al-Qaeda. To be honest, Nusayr's trial is pretty crazy. You guys should just look up it on Wikipedia. It's wow. Within this climate of non-state violence, the United States government found itself having to tackle the issue of violence being committed by and against Muslim and Arab activists. However, as we saw in the case of the LA8, and the use of secret evidence against mostly immigrants was used as a form of stifling and attacking the civil liberties of Arab and Muslim activists and their communities, especially demonizing the Palestinian cause and activism. This included harassing, racial profiling, secret evidence, the threat of deportation, counter-extremism and counter-terrorist rhetoric, the arresting of immigrants with almost no to useless information. And what we could see within this era is how the concern of Muslim organizing and activism by the government shifted from being anti-communist and anti-leftist and anti-black nationalist, shifting more towards a Muslim-centric, anti-Islamic, anti-Islamist, anti-Palestinian form of boogeymanism. Is that a word? For all intents and purposes, communism had faded away and Islamism was the new clash of civilizations. And I think it's beyond important as Muslims within the context of this country to understand the history of our own extremism and of our own community's agencies. It's not that we have to support these movements or these people, we could condemn them, we could criticize them all we want, but it's beyond importance to put them in the context of how our communities were organizing and also how our communities reacted to these people and how these people reacted to people outside of our community. If we don't involve these people in our discussions and our analysis, then we're simply lying to ourselves and our future generations will have to find this out on their own. And lastly, we don't get to control our own narratives. We let these counterterrorism experts control it for us. Now, this situation for Muslims, activism, and just community organizing was pretty tense, but things were kind of mellowing out. This all changed when the 9/11 attacks were carried out by Arab Muslim Osama bin Laden under the international Islamist terrorist group and network Al-Qaeda. And yes, Al-Qaeda did do 9/11. You're just too Islamophobic to acknowledge that jet fumes can melt steel beams within the context of 9/11. No surprise here, but Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric exploded across the country. And this is where I would call the post-9/11 Muslim order began.
I can hear you! I can hear you! The rest of the world hears you! And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
In short, it's an era where Muslims in the United States were placed in constant suspicion, isolation, and faced political violence. This violence was from outright anti-Muslim groups, militias, by non-state actors, but you also had government repression on flimsy evidence or borderline unconstitutional state actions. against innocent Muslims. In return, Muslims took a very apolitical and assimilationist viewpoint within the politics, or even just distanced themselves from politics altogether, as a lot of Muslim political agency at this time was tied or could be tied or would be demonized into some form of terrorism that had to be surveilled, destroyed, and isolated. Now, I'm sure most Muslims have seen the NYPD's Ancestries of Interest paper, which, hey, now I know it's used as a meme, but it also is a prime example of how anti-Muslim policies targeted Muslim political activism and the communities that these people came from, along with forcing an apolitical environment that Muslims still find themselves in today. Now, due to the sheer scale of the topic of anti-Muslim surveillance in America, I'm only going to be covering certain examples and not the whole problem. It's a big problem that's ongoing even until today. But hey, let's start off at ground zero, New York, where the NYPD, for all intents and purposes, led a surveillance campaign explicitly against the Muslim population in the American Northeast, specifically gauging it on how religious practices of Islam by suspected terrorists from both Sunnis and Shiites, immigrants or citizens. And remember, the list explicitly says American black Muslims, not Arabs, not non-Muslims from Muslim majority areas, Muslims. These reports even talk about how the measurement of surveillance was tied to how many times did someone pray, if someone spoke Arabic or Urdu publicly, if they played Al Jazeera within their restaurants, or even if they didn't play Al Jazeera at the restaurants, because in that case, they're avoiding surveillance and we should surveil them even more. NYPD did this under the boringly named Demographics Division that targeted New York masjids and the MSAs especially, probing the space for Muslim community organizers, committing entrapment plots, and monitoring any political discourse between Muslims. This surveillance was clear to the Muslim communities there, and they knew they were being targeted, and in an attempt to survive this surveillance, Muslims began to self-police their own spaces and began to depoliticize themselves. As stated in the report, Mapping Muslims, the stifling of expression is not limited to topics relating to Islamic nations, Arab politics, and domestic surveillance policies. Even current events unrelated to Islam or Muslims, but generally related to any type of protest or racially charged controversy, made some members of the community uncomfortable. Even regular discussions, like Trayvon Martin, people say, don't bring that up. Let's just talk about Hajj, pilgrimage. They wonder why this guy wants to talk about politics is seen as suspicious. By creating this environment of external police surveillance and internal self-policing, along with the threat of death, arrest, and deportation, it subjugated many Muslim communities into an apolitical environment, where criticism of American society, and I mean criticism of something as widespread as the murder of Trayvon Martin, could place the Muslim community and Muslim members under suspicion by their own community and by the police and government. Now, imagine criticizing the Iraq or the Afghanistan war within this context for many Muslims. Now, no surprise here, NYPD began to form their own culture of Islamophobia, hyping themselves up on the idea that almost every single Muslim organization was tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, and that Muslims were engaged in a wider jihadist plot to convert America and turn it into an Islamic state. Because you know who controls all the banks? The Qataris and CARE. For God's sakes, this is like BJP levels of love jihad. I'm going to love jihad your mom, Hindu nationalists. The NYPD was also known for screening this movie called The Third Jihad to their new recruits. Now, the whole thesis of Third Jihad is the whole every Muslim is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood and we have to stop them from Islamizing America. And Muslim social practices such as hanging out in the parking lot after Jum'ah and for some Muslims carrying religious items like talisman became areas of suspicion and detention and arrest. As stated by a Muslim police officer in the report, I would see emails from people in NYPD saying, I saw 10 people get together at 10 p.m. outside the mosque. So I told them about our culture, that congregation is normal Muslim behavior. Yusuf, former intelligence division officer. People were arrested for having something with words about God or a photo Quran in his pocket, or for having paper with Bismillah or Allah in their pockets for protection during travel. They would arrest them, and then they would call the intelligence division to investigate. Sometimes I went and signed off for their release. Now, things on the West Coast, as in California, as in Orange County, California, would be subject to their own surveillance and harassment of the Muslim community by the FBI. And despite statements by the head of the FBI, Steve Tidwell, declaring to a crowd of Muslim mosque goers that the FBI was not surveilling Muslims in Southern California, 2 months later after his statement, an FBI informant named Craig Montel would enter the masjids in Orange County under Operation Flex.
One, no, you're not. if we're going to come to mosque, to come to service, we will tell you we're coming to service.
Without anybody knowing.
The man in the audience replied, "You will send your agents without anybody knowing."
But what I'm saying, FBI, we will tell you we're coming for the very reason we don't want you to think you're being monitored.
That was June 5th, 2006. As best as we can determine, from people at the mosque and from testimony in court, 2 months after Tidwell reassured them that the FBI would not monitor them without telling them, the FBI placed an undercover informant in the mosque.
Craig pretended to convert to Islam and changed his name to Farouk al-Aziz. Within this time in the Southern California Muslim community, he began to compile a list of names, emails, phone numbers, and even license plates of Muslim community members. Craig, under the orders of the FBI, began to target the Orange County Muslim community for government surveillance, placing microphones in masjids and secretly forming Muslim community members there. He would even do things like taking people's cigarette butts to find their DNA and give their DNA samples to the FBI. Interestingly enough, Craig would use the gyms as a place of surveillance, mostly aiming at young Muslim men. Once Craig established himself in the Muslim community, Craig began to advocate and spread jihadist propaganda within the Orange County community, doing it so much so that community members began to complain about Craig to each other and would start to push him away from their circles. Now, the logic for Craig and the FBI was that by having Craig spread jihadist propaganda and talking points to the Muslim community, any Muslim that did not oppose Craig or report him to the FBI became a suspected terrorist, as any good-minded American citizen and Muslim would report jihadist talking points. Which is one hell of a logic when most of the community members were already telling Craig to stop talking about jihadist stuff and tried to push him away from it. Craig went as far as to incite, damn near entrap, a Muslim into a bombing plot, which is when Craig was finally officially reported to the FBI as a suspected terrorist by the Muslim community. A director at CARE named Hassan Alouche reported Craig to Steve Tidwell, the head of the FBI, the guy who said the FBI was not surveilling Muslims. Which I'm just going to let you guys listen to Alouche's reaction when he told Tidwell about this.
So, well, thanks, Hassan. You're doing the right thing. Thank these gentlemen. This is exactly why we're so proud of, working with the Muslim community. And I did mention, I said, he's a white guy, a white convert in Irvine. I said, oh, that's when he said, oh, okay, thank you, Hassan. That's great information, and we'll let you know what happens. I said, wait, don't you need his name? Because I had his name, and I have his address because they knew where he lived. He said, well, don't worry about it. We work closely with Irvine PD, and we'll take care of it from here. Don't worry about it. That's when my doubts started, playing in my head. I felt there was something strange.
Even after reporting Craig to the FBI, if anything, doubled down on their harassment of the Muslim community in Orange County, as now they were interrogating, harassing, coming to the homes of people who knew Craig or were friends with Craig, but never actually attacking Craig, who, let's all remember, is an agent provocateur in this Muslim community. Muslim community members were asked about their opinions on jihad, their opinions on Osama bin Laden, on what Craig was saying, but never anything about stopping Craig. which they couldn't. If anything, the people who reported Craig to the FBI then became targets for the FBI's arrest campaign. And we can see this in the case of Afghan immigrant Ahmed Nazi. Now, Craig, even in his own words, admit that he took aim at Ahmed Nazi because he was a social outcast. He consistently talked about jihad to Ahmed and was always trying to initiate the conversation about it. Ultimately, the FBI used this as evidence that Nazi was open to radicalism and should be investigated. Nazi, we should state, was critical of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. His sister was married or is married to Amin al-Haq, one of Osama bin Laden's personal bodyguard, and Ahmed Nazi does doubt who did 9/11. However, none of this is terrorism. When Ahmed was finally placed under FBI custody, the FBI tried to turn him into an informant or into a translator for the US military in Afghanistan, which he refused. Ultimately, Ahmed was charged with immigration fraud and false statements, not stating that his sister was married to one of bin Laden's personal bodyguard, but not terrorism. Craig, a few months later, after the end of Operation Flex, was arrested for drug dealing at the gym he was surveilling Muslims at. The FBI uses terrible people to surveil us. And I think the Orange County example is very important, which is that in the end, the FBI, via Craig, infiltrated the Muslim community, began to spread extremist stuff, and once the Muslim community acknowledged someone like Craig spreading this stuff and opposed him, reporting him to the FBI used this acknowledgement, which I should state the FBI started and the Muslims rejected, as an excuse to harass the Muslim community and attempted to entrap people into recruitment via fear and deportation. If anything, the Muslim community acted in a way which the US government should have seen as positive towards their counter-extremism, but if anything, people were punished for it. And no surprise here, but the relationship between the Muslim leadership and the FBI and LAPD and whatever has been damaged since then, as much of the Muslim leadership at this time prided themselves on working with the government, which maybe I'm going to sound rude saying this, but why is this surprising? The U.S. government is as trustworthy as you could throw the physical U.S. government. I mean, just ask Native Americans or black people about that experience. Hell, the U.S. government tortures and bombs Muslims and Muslim countries. Hell, the U.S. government bombs and tortures non-Muslims in America. Why would Muslim immigrant communities by any chance think they could just easily assimilate into American whiteness? And while the cases I brought up are tied more towards like local police or individual moments and actions, let's now look at how the U.S. government targeted Palestinian organizing under the guise of counterterrorism and how this was used to surveil Muslim agency once again. Now, people tend to talk about the Holy Land Five without talking about who the Holy Land Five are as people. They also show a diversity of Muslim political beliefs in the long history of immigrants and black Muslims who were operating in the 70s and 80s just to establish Muslim communities. So let's first start off with Ghassan Elash. Galash was ethnically cleansed from Gaza in the 1967 war, where he then lived within Egypt and Saudi Arabia, until he moved to the United States, where he established the first Muslim student organization in Kent State. He then organized the Muslim students and advocated for a prayer room and wudu room in Kent State. He also did this in the University of Miami, where he studied there. Shukri Abu Bakr. Born in Brazil, Shukri's family returned to Palestine, where they were then ethnically cleansed in 1967, where him and his family moved to Kuwait. Within Kuwait, Shukri became a member of the National Union for Palestinian Students. There's a teleprompter here for a reason, where he met Yasser Arafat and was given the nickname Shukri el-Batal, Shukri the hero. Shukri then moved to the United Kingdom, where he met Palestinian thinker Dr. Azam Tamimi before moving to the United States in 1980. Within the United States, he served as the president of the Islamic Society of Greater Florida before working at the Muslim Arab Youth Association, Maya, the Mayan Empire, and the Islamic Association of Palestine, which is still active until today. Muhammad el-Maizan, also known as Abu Ibrahim, became a Hafiz of Quran in Palestine before studying in Al-Azhar University and then moving to San Diego in 1999. Abu Ibrahim even describes himself as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Mufid Abdul Qadir, born in Silwad, Palestine, Abdul Qadir and his family was ethnically cleansed from Palestine in the 67 war and later settled in the United States in 1980. Fun fact, his half-brother is Khalid Mashal. Yes, that Khalid Mashal. And his father was a famous Palestinian resistance fighter and community organizer in the refugee camps in Jordan. Abdul Rahman AALDEF. Born in Palestine, he grew up in Kuwait. Originally called the Holy Land Fund, later changed to the Holy Land Relief and Development Foundation, HLF for short, was created in 1990 by Abu Ibrahim, Shukri Abu Bakr, and Ghassan Ilash. The trio created the HLF as a means of creating an American-based international network that would fundraise and could relieve the pressure of Israeli occupation on Palestinian life by providing food, healthcare, ambulances, creating hospitals, and education for the Palestinians in the occupied territories and in the diaspora, which in this case would be the refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. HLF quickly became the largest Muslim charity organization that especially centered itself on the Islamic principles of zakat. With the history out the way, let's look at the relief part of HLF. For example, HLF worked with the Islamic Relief Agency, the IRA, not that one, to begin operations within the West Bank. And it should be stated the IRA at this time was seen as a legitimate donation group even by Israel. HLF was able to form an office in the West Bank in 1993, established by Mohammed Anati, who was a Palestinian living in the occupied territories, and Shukri Abu Bakr, within the city of Jerusalem. This office worked with local organizations and social workers to help the orphans of Palestine and community outreach, which led to a creation of jobs and job opportunities for Palestinian workers and truck drivers. Operating within Israeli-approved charity programs, HLF expanded the Palestinian branch. What they also saw was an increase of Israeli raids targeting the branch and shutting down its office in 1995 due to constant IDF raids. The office then moved to the city of Aram. For example, Mohammed Anati faced detention by the IDF. He faced solitary confinement and interrogation for a whole year, where he was questioned by the Israeli military if HLF was funding Hamas or any armed Palestinian factions. Anati refused this and was later on approached by the FBI, who asked him the exact same questions. Anati alleges that the U.S. government was willing to give him American citizenship if he simply said HLF was funding armed groups in Palestine. Anati refused this request. However, harassment of the Palestinian branch continued. And when the Second Intifada began, HLF's whole system just saw an increase of work, as now HLF had to work with local NGOs and zakat committees across Palestine, doing things like providing wheelchairs to Gaza, bringing ambulances into the West Bank, and contributing to the creations of schools. And their work snowballed internationally. In 1995, when the Oklahoma City bombing was conducted by far-right terrorist Timothy McVeigh, HLF was the first Texas-based organization to send volunteers and collect blood donation for the victims, something that many of the Texas hospitals were thankful for. Likewise, in 1995, Shukri Abu Bakr traveled to Bosnia, where he organized relief efforts, which then led to other efforts in Albania, Chechnya, and parts of Africa. For example, in 1999, Abdul Rahman AALDEF, during the Kosovo Wars, operated a French-supplied, Turkish-run bakery for refugees in the Hamla refugee camp and coordinated with the United Nations and the Salvation Army and NATO forces. And while much that I covered is tied to now the relief efforts of the Holy Land Foundation, what we have to look at now is the creation of HLF as a Hamas front and how this narrative took shape. This narrative was pushed by very well-established pro-Zionist politicians, news outlets, and organizations, especially that of the Anti-Defamation League. The ADL especially accused HLF of supporting Hamas and even alluded to their donations as fronts for gun running and things of that sort. As stated in an ADL report called Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Extremist and Terrorist Threat to America. Which now let's all read the section that the ADL wrote about on HLF called Ramadan is the Month of Sacrifice. The IAP declared its goals during the month of Ramadan as the following. Nowadays, the Islamic world is facing quite a few challenges in many places. Alhamdulillah, the Intifada, which is a real jihad, is still going on and struggling against the occupation. Although the mass media is ignoring this jihad and trying to hide its continuity and strength, the goal of the IAP is to help our brothers and sisters inside Palestine, as well as calling all Muslims in North America to participate in a way or another in this help. We are ready to cooperate with all Muslims who would like to serve this sacred goal and work for Muslims inside Palestine. The IAP recommended that donations be sent to the Occupied Land Fund in Los Angeles, California, and asked Allah to reward all Muslims who work for the Islamic cause. The Occupied Land Fund has since changed its name to Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development and moved to Richardson, Texas, not far from the offices of the Dallas-based IAP. A Ramadan appeal sent to the Holy Land Foundation members in March 1993 denounces Israel's deportation of 413 Hamas and Islamic Jihad activists. Shukri Abu Bakr, the executive director of HLF, wrote, "None of those arrested and expelled were charged, tried, or convicted of any violent act. On the contrary, they embody the creation of Palestinian society. They are physicians, educators, religious scholars, and other key community leaders. Their only crime has been their ongoing effort to establish Palestinian social, health, and educational institutions that are independent of Israel." Now, as we can see, the document does not prove a single connection between HLF and Hamas. If anything, the most damning thing we have is the usage of the term jihad, which, let me say, doesn't really faze me or matter. Jihad is in Muslim vernacular, it's in the vocabulary. Let's use it more. If anything, we can see that Shukri states in relationship to the 413 Hamas members that, and I quote now, "None of those arrested and expelled were charged, tried, or convicted of any violent act." Meaning these were just Palestinians that got deported without a court date. This accusation of terrorism only continues. This becomes the reoccurring theme in the Holy Land Foundation and future Palestinian and Muslim organizing, which is a guilt of association towards terrorism and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. This is, of course, driven by anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Muslim and Islamic tropes. This is also the seeds being planted of like the Grand Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy theory, which is his grand conspiracy theory that all Muslim organizations are a front for the Muslim Brotherhood and plan to establish an Islamic state within the United States. I'll probably cover this theory in another video, and this has a lot of real-life implications on terrorism. Also, the FBI began a wiretap operation against Shukri Abu Bakr. Likewise, in 1994, the ADL and the American Jewish Congress began a campaign against HLF to revoke their tax-exempt status. And this surveillance was tied internationally too. When Abdul Rahman was doing relief work in Albania, which included feeding NATO troops, he was approached by the FBI, who inquired and asked him questions about the Mujahideen in Albania and if he was trying to recruit Mujahideen, and then the FBI tried to recruit him into the FBI as an informant. In 1995, HLF requested a meeting with the head of the Associate Director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Department of the Treasury. The group is known as OFAC. Now, HLF and other Muslim and Palestinian organizations held these meetings in the hope that the government would provide a framework to help these organizations that did charity work to not break the law and fund what the U.S. would designate as foreign terrorist organizations. However, the meeting never produced a framework for HLF or any of these other orgs to follow, and once the 9/11 attacks happened, HLF was declared a domestic terrorist organization by President George Bush in the opening stages of the GWAT era.
Yesterday, the Treasury Department froze the assets and accounts of the Holy Land Foundation in Richardson, Texas. whose money is used to support the Hamas terror organization. Earlier today, federal agents secured the offices and records of the Holy Land Foundation in Texas, California, New Jersey, and Illinois as a part of an ongoing investigation. At the same time, we have blocked the accounts of a Hamas-linked bank and a Hamas-linked holding company based in the West Bank.
The moment HLF became a designated terrorist organization, the hammer fell very fast on the Palestinian branch. All funds accumulated by HLF within the bank Cairo Amman, which had millions, now ran the risk of being freezed and seized by the United States government. In a moment of desperation, a Palestinian member within the West Bank named Hussein took the remaining funds and gave them out to Palestinians as a final act. Hussein then faced harassment from Israeli authorities trying to press him to become an informant and spy for the Shin Bet, which he denied and was banned from living in Palestine. This then forced Hussein, who was living in Palestine, to split away from his family to live in the United States because he's now banned from his own home country. And like so, the Holy Land Foundation's branch in Palestine was destroyed in the name of counterterrorism. In 2004, Shukri, Ghassan, Mufid, Abu Ibrahim, and Abdurrahman were arrested in morning raids by the FBI and local authorities. The 5 men were accused of providing material support to the foreign terrorist organization Hamas. Oh, and 10 counts of money laundering. The HO5 pleaded not guilty, and now give me some grace because this video is pretty long, so I'm going to oversimplify a lot of things. This could be its own video with its own psychoanalysis, social-political thing, and all that analysis, yada, yada, yada. Now, much of the accusations centered on the information gathered during the surveillance of the HO5, translations that alleged terrorism, and creating a connection between the Zakat committees in Palestine to Hamas, which also operates in Palestine. The claim was that the Holy Land Five were funding Hamas via Zakat committees, the logic being that the committees were Hamas run, or at the very least were giving funds to Hamas, and that HO5, by doing humanitarian work, was relieving pressure for Hamas to engage in their social programs. In short, helping Palestinians means you're helping Hamas. That's the argument. So let's look at the Zakat committees. The claim of the Zakat committee was spearheaded by Dr. Matthew Leavitt, an ideological Zionist and counterterrorism expert. These new experts are frequently unabashedly ideological. Their viewpoints, when they publish them, tend to find homes in partisan publications like National Review and the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. Hamas expert Matthew Leavitt, who has testified for the government in 8 trials since 2004, has a day job at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a conservative think tank founded by the former research director of AIPAC, the powerful pro-Israel lobby. Most of his accusations were based on Israeli classified documents that couldn't be verified by the defense team or the courts. Official Israeli documents weren't even reviewed. Unofficial documents couldn't be confirmed or denied by anybody. Likewise, Leavitt didn't speak Arabic or Hebrew, yet he claimed to be able to review the materials from the committees that allegedly glorify the activities of terrorism.
This list, in Arabic, this list says we are in an operation. The operation against Israel started in the 7th of October. This is a Guardian list, where every terrorist writes his name and every terrorist has his own shift guarding the people that were here.
So as we heard ourselves there from the IDF's official spokesman, Daniel Hagari, the IDF does claim that this poster is in fact a list of what they call terrorist names used in a form of a rota to guard the Israeli hostages. Now, this at the poster itself. Now, here at the top, it does say Al-Aqsa flood, and there is indeed the date of the 7th of October there as well. But there are no Hamas agents' names on this sheet whatsoever. In fact, there are no names at all. A little comparison with the days of the week in Arabic, we can indeed see that they match. So what we have here is the 7th of October, which was a Saturday, and we can see that it does match the text for a Saturday, and that continues throughout the paper. We can see Sunday. If we have a closer look there at Sunday, it does match the text for Sunday, and that the only names written on this piece of paper were in fact the days of the week. Now,
and I should state that the Zakat committees are seen as legitimate social structures in Palestinian society. Hell, prior to the creation of Hamas, it's Zakat as a concept in Islamic society. Much of these committees were approved by the U.S. government through USA aid. The misunderstanding of Zakat was followed by mistranslations by a person named Atif Shafiq, who was seen as the translator of the prosecution team and was poised to be the Islamic and Arab expert of this prosecuting team. Now, I should point out that Shafiq has no Islamic or Arabic credentials. Shafiq is an Egyptian Coptic Christian who speaks Egyptian Arabic, not Palestinian Arabic. The defense team couldn't review the original documents, translations, or recordings presented in the case and could only deal with the translations provided by the FBI and the accusing Zionist team due to secret evidence. So instead of speaking about the insanity of these recordings and translations, I'm just going to let the Holy Land Five speak about them on their own. Shukri pointed out another inaccuracy to me in a later letter. Shafiq alleged that regular Muslims do not use in their daily conversations terms such as Insha'Allah, Alhamdulillah, and so on. Terms that are part of almost every conversation in Arabic and used by Muslims, Christians, and Jewish Arabs all the time. Shafiq claims that these are phrases used by Muslim fanatics and extremists who hate Jews and want to destroy the West. Shukri also explained another mistranslation where using the correct words, it would have given the conversation an entirely different meaning. Here's how Shukri described it. The statement I made was, in the past we used to give the Muslims 100,000 and others 5,000. In essence, I was trying to assure the audiences that as a Muslim charity, we did direct most of our Zakat funds to Muslim organizations in Palestine because that was the expectation of the donors who trusted the HLF with their Zakat contributions. However, being a government agent keen on winning the case, Shafiq knowingly changed the context of my statements and made it sound sinister. He translated my statement as follow: we give the Islamists 100,000 and others 5,000. He changed the verb tense from past to present, and he changed the word Muslim to Islamist. After a long argument, he conceded that this was a mistake, but still insisted on using the term Islamist instead of Muslim. What this trial also shows us is the U.S. government and Israeli lobby's attempts to police Muslim political agency and spreading guilt of association. Muslim agency on political views were also demonized by the government and these Israeli lobbies. A great example being a secret recording in Philadelphia where Palestinian charity and political organizations were convening on how to react to the Oslo peace process and how that would affect their organizing in America. Within the meeting, some members gave their disapproval of the Oslo peace process, others voiced their opinions on Hamas. I should point out Hamas was not a designated terrorist organization at the time, and hell, Hamas was still in its early stages of being the Hamas today that we know. But beyond importance, Shukri Abu Bakr stated that HLF should not voice their opinions on political groups in Palestine. However, this recording was used to show that HLF was already in cahoots in conversation with Hamas. What we also see is a guilt by association, as HLF, they do have family members who are in Hamas, and this was used as possible evidence. Shukri Abu Bakr's brother, Jamal Issa, was a member of Hamas's political bureau and whose name was not on a designated terrorist list. Abu Ibrahim is related to Hamas fighter Musa Abu Marzouk. Elash's second cousin is also married to Abu Marzouk. And lastly, Abdul Qadir's brother is Khalid Mashal. However, none of this should matter. The HLF-5 is on trial, not their family members or their blood relatives. Like, imagine if all of America were charged for the war crimes of their family members, whether it's in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. Or, to make this sound much more aggressive, imagine if all Jewish people were charged with a war crime if they have family members who committed genocide in Gaza. This logic is destructive. And let me state, all of that doesn't matter to me. Palestinians have a right to support or be related to whoever they are, who they want to. And the fact that Palestinian commentary and political analysis and even Palestinian rage or disapproval was used as an excuse of possible terrorism shows an explicit attempt to demonize Muslim and political intelligence. It's used to argue Muslims to be in an acceptable political critique of American power. As said by Muhammad al-Kurd, using the wrong words has the magic ability to make objects disappear. The boots, bullets, batons, and bruises all become invisible if you say the wrong words in jest or in fury. The courtroom, for all intents and purposes, was a battleground of international politics, a type of intifada, you might say, where Israeli intelligence went to war with Palestinian charity and social society. One of the accusers was Major Lior, an anonymous witness who was a confirmed Israeli intelligence official that needed an English translator because he only spoke Hebrew. Major Lior's role was to provide the documents proving that the Zakat committees were linked to Hamas, captured during Operation Defensive Shield in 2006 within the West Bank. Likewise, another person was Avi, another anonymous witness who was a part of the Israeli security agency. Avi described the charities as a general jihad, arguing that this is a general holy war against Israel. Avi ultimately couldn't point out a single armed group that the Zakat committee was connected to. I should state that the defense team used Ed Abington as one of their witnesses. He was the U.S. Consulate General of Jerusalem from 1993 to 1997. For all intents and purposes, he's like an ambassador for Palestinians and Americans. And just to show his importance, Abington helped in the negotiations between Palestinian and Israeli diplomats leading to the creation of the Palestinian Authority. Abington also visited HLF-funded hospitals, and he described the Zakat committees as historical institutions in Palestinian society that were as grassroots as it can be. When Abington was asked about these Israeli documents, arguing that the committees were infested with Hamas militants and supporters, Abington said the State Department considered the documents essentially a propaganda exercise by the Israelis to undermine the reputation of the Palestinian Authority. He said, "You can't really rely on these documents as showing a true picture." Due to how vague everything was, in 2007, the first trial ended in a mistrial, and all men were given not guilty verdicts or practically didn't go to jail. This led to an immediate second trial in 2008. It's practically the exact same thing as the first trial, but the men were now being charged with separate charges, not collectively together, along with more illegitimate tax returns and breaking the law and tax stuff. This time the accusation was that HLF should know where the funds were going and who were running the Zakat committees. And if all members were Hamas members, and they should know the effects of the Zakat committees and if they positively help Hamas. We should take into account that HLF and other Arab and Palestinian organizations back in the 90s tried to contact the US government on creating stronger guidelines on what counts as supporting domestic terrorist groups, but never got a response. Due to all the responsibility put on the Holy Land group now, things got pretty bad. Once again, Avi and his documents were used. The defense team continued to point out that many of these documents were incomplete, they were missing the context of Palestinian society, and were captured after the closing of the HLF group. Importantly, is that a word? The defense team could not acquire the same documents as they were secret evidence and classified, thus separating the defense team from the context of these documents. Likewise, a Gaza-born witness named Mohammed Shorbaji, who never went to the West Bank, testified that HLF was funding the Zakat committees and they were Hamas-run. At the time of the second trial, Shorbaji was arrested for embezzling money that was supposed to allegedly go to Hamas. When Shorbaji became a witness, the charges of embezzling were almost dropped entirely. Likewise, Steve Simon, who worked on the National Security Council from 1994 to 1993 when he was brought up to the case, kept on evoking the 9/11 attacks and Islamic terrorism. That was his whole role. His role was simply to demonize the Muslim and Palestinian criticism of things like the Oslo peace process and tie them to armed factions that were trying to undermine the peace process, i.e. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, so on and so forth. In the end, the 5 were then found guilty of all counts. Mufrid was given 25 years. Abu Ibrahim and Abdur Rahman were given 15 years. And Ghassan and Shukri were given 65 years. And this is clearly an example of government and non-state repression of Palestinian and Muslim activism through Islamophobic and anti-Muslim tropes. However, let's return back to Black Islam. Remember the Dar-ul-Islam movement that was now a nationwide movement that comprised of mostly African-American masjids? Well, by the late 90s and early 2000s, the Dar movement was kind of wounded. Just like many black power or black type organizing things, it faced the death of 1,000 cuts, from internal splits, arguments over leadership, disputes over how to deal with the immigrant Muslim community and vice versa, disputes over what forms or how to practice Islam was also popping up, along with things as simple as lacks of funds and money, meant that the movement was facing its own splits too. From its peak of being a nationwide movement, the Dar had now transitioned to a shell of its former self. And what I am going to pull up is slightly disputed, but allegedly, apparently this is disputed. The Dar-ul-Islam movement also had some form of internal fragmenting with the creation of a group called Al-Ummah. It will show up later, just trust me. Now, what I know isn't controversial or ahistorical to say or disputed or whatever the hell term people want to use is that in the end, the Dar-ul-Islam movement was led by Imam Jamil Al-Amin, also known as H. Rap Brown. Now, H. Rap Brown was a major figure in the Black Power movement, being known as the 5th chairman of the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a short-lived position called the Minister of Justice in the Black Panther Party. H. Rap Brown's life is full with a lot of twists, turns, speeches, controversies, so please forgive me for oversimplifying all of that. But H. Rap Brown was known for his nationwide speeches, his ability to organize people. Hell, he had a federal law written up against him, officially called the Anti-Riot Act of 1968, but unofficially known as the Rap Brown Act. No surprise here, H. Rap Brown faced government repression and surveillance, being shot at, being shot by, being arrested by the government, placed on house arrest, so many things. Once arrested, for sure this time, H. Rap Brown converted to Islam in 1971, changing his name to Jamil Al-Amin in Rikers prison with the help of the Dar-ul-Islam movement.
The name Jamil, which the Arabic translation is beautiful, Abdullah means servant of Allah, and the Al-Amin is the trustworthy, which was one of the titles that the Prophet was known by, trustworthy.
Was it in prison that you embraced Islam?
I became Muslim. I took a shahada, what's called the Declaration of Faith, when I was incarcerated, when I was in prison, when I was on Rikers Island.
And who bestowed that name on you?
There was a strong Islamic movement known as the Dar-ul-Islam movement, which was headquartered at Senate at the Yasin Mosque out in Brooklyn. And they used to come inside the prisons to conduct the Jummah, the Friday services. So it was these brothers who came in, and one of the brothers who invited me to come to Jummah. And I went several times before becoming Muslim, but after becoming Muslim, one of the brothers gave me the name.
Once he was released from jail in 1976, Amin moved to Atlanta, where he became a community organizer, being held in high regards for combating gang violence, drug trafficking, and alcohol abuse in Atlanta's West End. Other than community policing, Amin helped organize the Muslim community in the West End, encouraging much of the youth to go into higher education and become imams. He gained like a celebrity status, even serving food to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at one point. Likewise, Imam Amin was able to help build a community of Muslim families that are still present in Atlanta's West End until today. the West End was known as a non-crime area. Within national organizing, Imam Amin became a giant. He later on helped create the National Majlis Ashura of North America, which is a network that comprised of the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, Islamic Circle of North America, ICNA, along with the Ministry of Worthy Muhammad and his own national group. Talk about unity. Within this position, Imam Amin worked on creating a united network of Muslim structures that would engage in political activism, such as Palestinian awareness, along with organizing a rally for people to march in D.C. to put pressure on the U.S. government to help stop the Bosnian genocide. Imam Amin went on to form connections with 40 masjids in the Caribbean. Talk about international stuff. But even with these positive changes, Imam Amin did not become some apolitical person. If anything, his Islam made him a better organizer. Imam Jamil al-Amin was still being surveilled and targeted by the U.S. government in this time, an echo or maybe a continuation of COINTELPRO, which were used to target black radicals such as Imam Amin himself. In 1995, Amin was arrested in a joint operation conducted by the FBI, the ATF, and local police that claimed that Imam Amin had shot a man outside of his grocery store, with the victim labeling Imam Amin as a gunman. However, a few weeks later, the victim revised his claim and said Imam al-Amin did not shoot him, and the charges were dropped.
The case that they're bringing forth, I don't have anything to do with it other than they arrested me.
Al-Amin says he and other members of his mosque were finishing night prayer and heading home about the time of the incident. He says he knew nothing about the shooting until someone told him about it. Al-Amin says he then went to see the shooting victim to find out for himself what happened.
Someone apparently talked to him and coerced him into to making a statement against me in particular. So again, as to how they came about the information, the one who asked knows as much as the one who is asked.
Al-Amin says he doesn't know the wounded man identified as William Miles or why anyone would want to shoot him. But you're saying that's not your gun?
No.
Do you know this man who was shot?
No more than when I went to speak to him at his house, no.
The Muslim minister is angry that a task force of local and federal police with guns drawn arrested him in the presence of his young son. A generation ago, he was Minister of Justice for the Black Panther Party.
Never seen him use any form of violence or coercion. I've never seen him with a gun or anything. I've only seen him verbally tell people on the street that he doesn't want them selling drugs in our neighborhood.
There's been constant surveillance by the FBI. There's one agent in particular who has been assigned to the case who has made public pronouncements that his intention is to get me.
Harassment continued into 1999, where Amin was pulled over by the police alleging that the car he recently bought was stolen, which Imam Amin denied. In a following search of his car, a bill of sale was found, along with a police badge, which Imam Amin stated and was later confirmed by Mayor John Jackson was given to him as a sign of positive civic duty engagement and all that stuff. However, Amin was charged with speeding, grand theft, and impersonating a police officer. On March 16th, 2 Atlanta sheriff deputies went to al-Amin's house to execute a warrant for failing to appear in court over a traffic stop in 1999. The officers serving this warrant knocked on the house of al-Amin and received no response. As they were leaving, they saw an individual in a parked black Mercedes-Benz who they believed was Imam Amin. The officers then returned to the location and parked in front of this car to apprehend the suspect. The officers asked this person to step out of the car, and when the person stepped out of the car, they engaged the police officers with an assault rifle, killing one and wounding another one in the following shootout. In the next few days, Imam Amin was identified as the shooter by the 2 wounded police officers. He was then arrested in a manhunt in Whitehall, Alabama. As he was arrested, he was thrown on the ground and spit on by FBI officer Ron Campbell. Likewise, an assault rifle and handgun was found with Amin. However, this is heavily disputed by the civil rights group CARE, and Amin argues that the guns were planted on him. And when we begin to look at the stories presented by both sides, we begin to see where controversy arises, as the defense team argues Amin is innocent of the shooting and that his arrest is politically motivated. When we look at the court cases, Amin's defense team brought 20 witnesses, where 2 who saw the shooter said the shooter did not fit Amin's physical description at all, which Imam Jamil al-Amin was described as a tall and lanky person. Likewise, the deputy who identified Amin was wounded in the gunfire and was blinded when his pepper spray can was shot. Both deputies claimed that the shooter was wounded in the gunfight, with a blood trail being found at the gun site. However, the blood at the blood trail was not Amin's blood. Likewise, when Amin was arrested, he had no bullet wounds on him. Also, when Amin was arrested in Whitehall, the supposed weapons of the shooting that were found with Amin did not have his fingerprints, nor did Amin have any gunpowder residue on his body. Amin argued that the weapons found on him were planted on him. When asked about fleeing the West End to Whitehall, Alabama, and his car being shot up, Amin states that earlier in the day he got into an argument and he scared off some local drug dealers, and at the time of the shooting he believed that he was being targeted in a retaliation attack and fled following the shooting. One of the deputies shot, Deputy English, claims that the shooter had gray eyes. Imam Jamil al-Amin has brown eyes. We have to take into account the deputies were sedated with medicine and drugs when they pointed out Amin as the gunman and when they're being questioned. With all of this presented, Imam Jamil al-Amin and his defense team believed that this was strong enough evidence, with Amin not even speaking at his own court case. However, Amin was charged and given life with no parole. A few years later, a man known as Otis Jackson claimed responsibility for the shooting. However, the courts have refused to acknowledge or accept this, and Amin was given life in prison where he died.
1997 to December 22nd of 2000.
Yes, sir.
All right. Isn't it true that during that incarceration you contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigations and told them that you had committed a murder and were involved in the shooting of a cop in March of 2000 in Atlanta, Georgia?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
All right. And you couldn't have because you were in prison in Nevada, right?
No, sir. I got out of prison in 2000 in February. I was on house arrest when the murder took place. You might want to check that out. I was on house arrest. I was staying at 2380 Jernigan Street, Southwest Atlanta.
You just said that you were incarcerated in Las Vegas in 1997 through December of 2000.
I went back to prison after that shooting. I was violated and sent back to prison after the police shooting. That's why it says BP by my name. That's parole violation. If you look at the photo, it says BP beside my number. That means parole violation.
You violated your probation because you went back to prison.
Exactly. I violated after the shooting.
You were interviewed by the Federal Bureau of Investigations for that out there in Nevada prison, were you not, in July?
Yes, sir.
Of that year?
Yes, sir.
And he ruled you out and said you did not commit that murder in Las Vegas, correct?
I don't know what
that murder in Atlanta.
I have no idea what his conclusion was, sir.
All right, you weren't arrested for it, were you?
No, sir, I was not.
In fact, another person was tried and convicted.
Jamil al-Amin, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And once again, it seems to me like you were getting a lot of
I was shot that day.
I'm sorry?
I was shot March of 2000. It happened March 17th of 2000.
Your Honor, we can take a break right now. Come back. Okay.
Now, in my opinion, if that does matter, Imam Jamil al-Amin's arrest is a part of, at the very least, a pattern, if not an effort, of the U.S. government arresting or targeting massive organizations and organized leaders that may threaten, have threatened, or could threaten dominant American domestic, political, or foreign agency. This could be things from Palestinian organizing to Black Muslim radicalism, or even just the echoes of possible Black radicalism. This kind of all bleeds into like the arresting and the slandering and the guilt by association of mass Muslim movements, or even individual imams that are critical of American foreign or domestic policy. And this all just adds into like levels of policing Muslims and the history of Muslim political repression in America. But we're not done with the Dar. With the imprisonment of Imam Jamil al-Amin, the Dar-ul-Islam movement, or the Ummah movement, lost another influential leader. And to be kind of blunt, by this time, the Dar movement, the Ummah movement, however it was defined by this point, was on its last legs. Leaders were arrested. The movement was split. The movement was kind of gone. The movement was also heavily infiltrated by the government after 9/11. And the changing Muslim communities that shifted away from like political activism of the 70s, 80s, were now shifting towards apoliticalness in a post 9/11 world. The final nail for the Dar-ul-Islam movement, in my opinion, was the killing of Imam Luqman Amin Abdullah, who became the de facto leader of the remnants of Dar-ul-Islam. Now, according to the FBI, already close to the arrest of Imam Jamil al-Amin, which means he was already being surveilled, Dar-ul-Islam had made a tactical choice to split into al-Ummah and to fragment the group so that they could face less government repression. The successor of Dar de facto was now Imam Luqman Amin Abdullah, who was in charge of the group al-Ummah, which its existence is kind of disputed by CARE. But I think ultimately the death of Imam Luqman Amin Abdullah shows government repression once again. And I should state that the case of Imam Luqman Amin Abdullah is highly controversial, highly disputed. Sources are so opposite of each other. What I'm going to do is present the government counterterrorism side, and then the more like CARE, social justice, activist critique side, and then just let the audience pick where they want to go. Funny enough, a lot of the counterterrorism stuff that I read for Middle Eastern groups were used for this part of the video. It's Foucault's boomerang. Foucault was a weird guy. When we look at Long War Journal, they take the FBI reports, which claims that the official government narrative is that Luqman Abdullah became the next leader of the Al-Ummah movement after Jamil al-Amin's arrest. During Al-Ummah's final years, Luqman turned the organization into a criminal enterprise that had tied itself to murder, mail fraud, insurance fraud, a lot of fraud, and justified itself based on religious beliefs that they were conducting offensive jihad against the United States government. Luqman Abdullah allegedly gave verbal support to Hezbollah, the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden. Talk about a position that one can only hold prior to the Arab Spring. The documents allege that Luqman Abdullah saw these movements as like Muslim jihadist groups fighting against American foreign policy in the Middle East, and that these organizations should be given support. Much of these opinions were verbalized and said around either Luqman Abdullah's supporters and followers or private informants, and that the masjid owned by Luqman Abdullah had firearms, illegal knives, and karate stuff found in it. Now, ultimately, Al-Ummah was crushed when Luqman Abdullah was confronted by law enforcement agents in the Joint Terrorism Task Force in a sting operation where Luqman and other armed Al-Ummah members were conspiring to sell and buy illegal goods. Likewise, they were conspiring to commit mail fraud through insurance scams that involved arson. Likewise, the group provided firearms and body armor to known convicted felons and tampered with motor vehicle identification numbers that led to the theft of these vehicles. In the end, Luqman Abdullah was killed in a sting operation where he fired upon a police deputy before Luqman Abdullah was shot by a whole military squad. This is where the FBI then faced criticisms by civil rights groups and CARE for violating Luqman Abdullah's civil rights. The FBI investigated themselves and found no violation in their conduct. Now, let's look at the counter-narrative. The counter-narrative is presented by CARE and Abdullah supporters. The Al-Ummah movement was not a black caliphate separatist movement. At most, Luqman wanted to see the formation of strong and highly concentrated Muslim communities akin to the Mormons or something like that, where they'd be able to implement a form of Sharia law among themselves. For Luqman, his son does acknowledge that his father was critical of the U.S. government, but never committed any terrorist actions. If anything, even in the FBI reports, an FBI informant tried to convince Abdullah to have Al-Ummah commit a terrorist attack, and Abdullah immediately refused or even entertained that idea. This nuance of Luqman is even pointed out in an Intercept article. While the government and national media have generally portrayed Abdullah as a leader of a violent extremist gang and highlighted numerous anti-government statements he made in the presence of covert informants, local activists have painted a more complex picture of him, saying that he was widely admired in Detroit for funding social programs and combating local drug dealers. Dawood Walid, who knew Abdullah for many years and now serves as executive director of CARE Michigan, told The Intercept that despite Abdullah's often incendiary criticism of the U.S. government, he was viewed as a positive force among the residents of his impoverished Detroit community, organizing soup kitchens and housing for the poor through the auspice of his mosque. This viewpoint is also supported by local imams who stated that he never gave support to terrorism and they were surprised by these FBI claims. CARE also points out that within this sting operation that occurred within a warehouse with alleged stolen goods were all paid by the government, and the person who invited Luqman Abdullah and his group to this warehouse was an FBI informant.
Who claimed to have converted to Islam with a tattoo on his neck, was acting as a agent provocateur within the community. There was a staged raid that took place on October 20th, 2009 in a warehouse in East Dearborn. And the charges against some members in the community in which Imam Luqman drove this confidential informant to the warehouse that day was a claim of that the community members were involved in a conspiracy to sell stolen goods. So obviously it wasn't stolen goods, number one, it was conspiracy because the government paid for everything. The government paid for the warehouse. The government paid for all the goods that was being used for the mech trucks. So the trucks that were coming in, moving goods, the pallets, everything was paid for by our taxpayer dollars, over $1 million operation that went on for years as a means of trying to, the claim was that the community and members were trying to sell stolen goods in order that they could establish a Sharia or establish Islamic sacred law in one of the poorest zip codes in the United States of America.
There's only a space heater to warm the room in sub-freezing temperatures. Luqman and many others like him believe in revolution, but not the political kind.
Even within FBI documents, we see a lot of material transaction towards Luqman. Likewise, Luqman firing upon this agent is disputed by many of these civil rights care groups, with these orgs arguing that Luqman did not have his fingerprints on the gun or his bloodstains on the gun. I should have also pointed out earlier that the officer killed in this shootout was a canine. Yes. And after the shooting happened, the task force picked to airlift the dog and left Luqman Abdullah to bleed to death, which the FBI also disputes and says that Luqman was killed immediately after the shooting. In the end, both Luqman Abdullah and the dog died. However, I think it's important to see that Luqman was placed in a counterinsurgency framework. Levels of isolation, character assassination, one could really argue entrapment, and lastly, elimination. This can be summarized by his son, Omar Reagan, who described it as unfinished business from COINTELPRO. And now we're at the conclusion of this video. This is not scripted. When I started this video, Imam Jamil Al-Amin was still alive. And now that I'm done with the video, Imam Jamil Al-Amin has returned to Allah. I think what we're living through right now are two amazing moments, or maybe concerning moments, for the Muslim American community here. The first one, which I don't think could be seen as amazing, is that a lot of the older guard of Muslim political and even just social organizing, they're passing away now. And we're reaching a moment where their history could honestly be lost. However, we're also at a moment where Muslim political agency and activism is on a rise ever since the genocide in Gaza began, ever since October 7th happened. I think that's an amazing thing to witness and to be a part of. However, I just feel this sense of like concern that this country has a long history of dealing with Muslim activists, and organizations like CARE are going to be needed more than ever, and just people who even want to work beyond CARE. Things such as the Palestinian Youth Movement are positive developments, I would say, in the Muslim spaces. It's not the end, it's not the conclusion. As Imam Jamil Al-Amin said, our concern should be defining our struggles, not just joining movements. We're also seeing a rise of the police state that has kind of always been on the Muslim community here, but now we're really seeing it take shape and aim at even the non-Muslim majority. Donald Trump declaring something like anti-fascism as domestic terrorism and the usage of terms like cartel terrorism, and his, of course, employment of ICE as a form of policing the Muslim community and threatening and using deportation as a justification of killing on our communities is concerning. But don't think this is me being a cynic. At the same time, look at the Muslim community from Malcolm X to now. It was one of constant growth and struggle and hardship. It's something that demands firmness from us, thabat. And it's something I think is needed in this generation. Imagine if the Muslim communities here stopped at Malcolm X's assassination. Imagine if the Muslim community here stopped at LA 8 or stopped at Jamil Al-Amin or at Luqman Abdullah or at the Holy Land 5. Then people in my generation wouldn't be where we are now. Islam wouldn't be where it is now if the Muslims stopped at the first person who disliked them. So if I am to give a conclusion, I guess it would be I would say to be more politically aware, to know your history, and to be critical at times of your history or of even the movements you might be a part of or will be a part of or thought about or whatever. Because we're living in a time of uncertainty. Pre-October 7th setup has changed. And we even see this in our domestic politics with just overtly fascistic, overtly anti-Muslim, damn right genocidal talk. This is a moment where the Muslim community needs to be more active in our circles. And I would argue to form a stronger sense of Muslim solidarity within our communities. One where the Black Muslim radical tradition, or whatever the heck people want to define it as, is in community with immigrant Muslims who have faced their own form of repression. We all know America is a society that sees color. It's not colorblind. But color is not enough to form belief. And I think, or I believe, this could be a golden opportunity where Black, immigrant, white, whatever type of Muslims, at least in the American context, can build stronger bridges between each other and weather whatever storm this is. And once we survive it, continue to flourish and build our communities together. That's all I have for now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.